Technical Sergeant Herman Scearce completed his 40th combat mission and whispered softly, 40. The night strike on Iwo Jima had been routine, bombs dropped on airfield. Number 2, searchlights groped, but the pilot slipped away. During the return flight, he stood at the waist window and counted to himself 36, 37, 38, 39, and now 40. Then, in his tent on Guam, he lay back and said the word aloud. Our story begins in December 1943 in the Central Pacific. December 1943. The Central Pacific. For the men of the 42nd Bombardment Squadron, the war had become a grinding cycle of long flights, fierce flak, and sudden violence. On the first day of December, at the base on Funafuti, an operations corporal quietly wakes Technical Sergeant Herman Scearce. Scearce watches his friend Staff Sergeant Bob Leip pull on his boots, tuck his .45 pistol under a mattress, and head out the door. Leip is flying with Lieutenant Deschard's crew today, filling in for an assistant engineer who broke his collarbone in a crash landing weeks before. Scearce says, "See ya," and Leip replies, "See ya." There's a gravity to this simple goodbye that Scearce will never forget. The mission is a strike against Mill Atoll. 7 B-24s take off at dawn. One aborts with engine trouble. Another turns back with a cylinder head failure. A third gets lost in heavy clouds and dumps its bombs into the ocean. By noon, only 3 planes get over the target. Anti-aircraft fire is light and inaccurate, but the Japanese gunners have the altitude just right. Lieutenant Deckard follows Captain Jesse Stay over the target, makes his bomb run, and then vanishes from the sky. No radio call, no distress signal, just the empty hum of the ocean below. The plane never returns. Back on Funafuti, the squadron waits. Hours pass. Hushed speculation turns to dread. Scearce knows something the others do not. He remembers the crash landing of Naughty Nanette on Nanumea Island weeks before. That plane limped in with 3 engines sputtering and ran out of gas just short of the runway. When it hit the ground nose first, a metal ammunition box left in the nose wheel compartment had prevented the wheel door from opening. The front of the plane was crushed, and the assistant engineer broke his collarbone jumping from a waist window that was now absurdly high off the ground. If that ammo box had not been left in the wrong place, the assistant engineer would not have been injured. If he had not been injured, Leip would not have been detailed to Deschard's crew, and Leip would not be missing in the Pacific. Scearce keeps this knowledge to himself. There is nothing to gain by telling anyone. 19 days later, on December 20th, the squadron strikes Malawalap Atoll. 9 B-24s form into 3 flights of 3 planes each carrying 6 500-pound bombs. Malawalap is defended by search radar, which gives the Japanese time to get their gunners ready and their Zero pilots into the air. The flak over the target is intense, with bursts ahead to greet the air crews and warn them they are not on a milk run. Among the bombers is Dogpatch Express, the familiar aircraft piloted by Lieutenant George Smith. Scearce is not on this flight, but his friends are. He waits on Funafuti with the rest of the ground crew, listening to the rumble of distant war reports on the radio. Over Malawalap, flak knocks out engine number 4 on Dogpatch Express and drills holes through the fuselage and tail. Co-pilot Lieutenant John Lowry looks to his right to confirm the engine is feathered when another shell tears through the aluminum skin beneath the flight deck and explodes in the cockpit. The top turret is blown out, its glass smeared with blood. Number 3 engine catches fire, streaming white smoke behind the crippled plane. The other B-24s circle back, dropping through clouds to form up on either side of the stricken aircraft. Their gunners blazing at the Zeros pressing the attack, but the damage is too severe. Lieutenant Smith is losing altitude fast. At 1:45 in the afternoon, 90 miles east of Malawalap, Dogpatch Express hits the water. The plane breaks in half on impact, as B-24s always do when they ditch. The nose sinks immediately. The rear section of the bomb bay and the trailing edges of the wings stay above the surface for just 3 or 4 minutes. Then the sea closes over them. Zero strafe the wreckage. Lieutenant Sands drops to 50 feet and sees one man across a partially inflated raft, maybe another in the water beside it. The crew drops more rafts and calls for rescue. A Navy Catalina flying boat searches the area, but there are no survivors, no trace. The men of the 42nd who are not there can only hope, and hope fades by nightfall. The same mission claims another plane, but this story ends differently. Bell of Texas, piloted by Lieutenant Charlie Pratt, takes over 300 hits from flak and machine guns. The hydraulics are gone, the brakes are gone, the plane is riddled with holes, but the crew, remarkably, is unhurt. Pratt cannot make it back to Funafuti on the fuel he has left. He steers toward Tarawa, where Navy Seabees have just finished a short fighter strip on Buota Island. The strip ends in a narrow stretch of beach with the Pacific Ocean beyond. Pratt tells his crew to prepare for a landing without brakes, a landing that will either work or kill them all. 300 feet from touchdown, engine number 1 sputters and stalls. Pratt throttles up number 2, evens the plane's thrust, and goes around for another try. At 110 miles per hour, as slowly and as delicately as possible, the main gear touches down. The crew throws parachutes out the waist windows and the tail, hoping they will billow full and slow the plane. Bell of Texas rumbles and bounces onto the beach and comes to a stop just feet from the water's edge. The grateful crew climbs out and surveys their airplane, shot full of holes by guns of every description. They have survived. The plane has survived. It is the finest aircraft they have ever seen. They will say, and they mean it. Enjoying the story? Subscribe to join us for the next one. 10 men dead or missing from Dogpatch Express. 10 men alive from Bell of Texas, counting their blessings and their bullet holes. The contrast of that single day is brutal. On Funafuti, Scearce and the others learn the news. They have lost their plane, their familiar companion in the sky. Dogpatch Express is gone. The men who flew in her are gone. The war has taken another piece of what they trusted, and the only answer is to keep flying, because the missions do not stop, and the empty bunks in the tent fill up with new men who do not yet know the weight of what they have inherited. In early February 1944, Scearce and Jack Yankus found themselves assigned to a volunteer crew, tasked with retrieving the patched-up Bell of Texas from Tarawa. The Navy mechanics of Casu-16 had repaired hundreds of bullet holes and replaced damaged wiring, but the first flight back to Oahu turned into a nightmare. A violent storm engulfed the Liberator, forcing the pilots to drop to 50 feet above the churning ocean, where the air was marginally smoother. Scearce tried raising Hickam on the radio, but heard only static, as rain pelted the cockpit glass and the old bomber groaned and shuddered around them. For hours they flew blind, until the plane burst into blinding sunlight near Oahu, the ordeal over. Weeks later, on February 24th, Captain Joe Deasy flew Scearce to Kwajalein for a meeting with Army intelligence officers. There they reviewed captured Japanese documents and learned that Lieutenant Louis Zamperini and Lieutenant Russell Phillips, the pilot and bombardier of the Green Hornet, lost the previous May, had survived their crash and were being held as prisoners of war. A third man, Sergeant Francis McNamara, had died on the 33rd day adrift. Scearce felt a sickening regret, realizing how close they had come to spotting the raft during the search mission months before. He and Deasy had done their best, but the truth of it settled in Scearce like a weight he could not set down. By April, Deasy was hospitalized with tuberculosis at Tripler General Hospital on Oahu, his combat flying finished. Scearce and Yankus bought him a leather toiletry kit embossed with his name and visited him in his room, where he tearfully thanked them before being transferred to Colorado. With his crew reassigned, Scearce worried about ending up with a green pilot, but he was soon assigned to Captain Jesse Stay's crew. To ease the grind of base life, he bought a black 1932 Packard from an infantry officer for $400 and began stealing aviation gasoline under cover of darkness, keeping the tank low enough to evade the MP's siphon hoses. The car gave him a taste of freedom on Oahu, a small independence in the long months of rebuilding and training. September 12, 1944. 30 miles east of Oahu, 3 B-24s from the 42nd Bomb Squadron practiced formation gunnery at 4,000 feet. The morning sky was clear, the Pacific calm below. On the ground at Mokulea Air Base, Scearce and Yankus were looking for a pinochle game, bored by the lull before the squadron's move to the front. Far out at sea, Lieutenant Thomas Riel's B-24 began to trail smoke and bank away from the other two bombers. An oxygen bottle had exploded in the fuselage. Flames from the bomb bay reached into the rear compartment, and the flight deck filled with fire. Men bailed out from the burning plane. 3 parachutes opened, 7 others never cleared the wreckage. The B-24 nosed over and fell, exploding when it hit the water. Back at the barracks, the noise from a betting pool on a guard drinking a doctored bottle of whiskey died away. Someone said a plane had gone into the drink. Scearce and Yankus walked back to their bunks in silence. 3 survivors were pulled from the ocean that day. Of the 7 dead, 2 had been reassigned to Reel's crew just weeks before. The squadron absorbed the news and kept preparing for the move to Guam. Before leaving Oahu, Scearce sold the black 1932 Packard he had bought that spring. An infantry officer paid him $400, the same price Scearce had given months earlier. The car had given him freedom, a way to dodge military police and steal aviation gas. Now it was a loose end, cut clean. On October 22, 1944, Scearce flew into Guam with the first flight of 4 B-24s, landing on a runway still under construction. Guam was a mess. Rain fell in sheets. Roads were thick, sucking mud. The squadron area was a sea of tents pitched on bare dirt, and every hole dug for a latrine hit a coral head a few feet down. Scearce and Ed Hess looked at their tent floor, a wet, stomped-down patch of mud, and decided it would not do. They borrowed a 2.5-ton truck and drove to a Marine supply depot. A Marine guard stood at the gate. Hess offered him several bottles of Air Corps liquor, held out like currency. The Marine took the bottles and nodded. Scearce and Hess backed the truck up to a stack of plywood, working fast, sliding each sheet into the bed. When the stack was gone, they gunned the truck back to the squadron area. Within hours, the enlisted men of Captain Stay's crew had the first floored tent in the 11th Bomb Group area. Men came by just to see it. Hess pointed at the plywood and said, "Supply requisition." On October 28th, Scearce flew his first combat mission from Guam. 12 B-24s struck the Japanese airfield at Colonia on the island of Yap. Captain Stay's plane dropped 6 500-pound bombs directly onto an anti-aircraft battery north of the runway. The return fire was weak and inaccurate. No enemy fighters appeared. The squadron was back in business after 11 months away from the front. Scearce logged his 7th strike mission and felt the old rhythm return: the briefing, the climb, the bomb run, the long ride home. On the ground, a blown hydraulic hose sprayed brown fluid across the right landing gear as Stay taxied to the hardstand. The crew shut down the engines and climbed out into Guam's damp, heavy air. The mission done, late October 1944 gave way to November, and the 42nd Bomb Squadron prepared for an entirely new kind of mission. Codenamed Mike, these were low-altitude mine-laying raids against Japanese harbors in the Bonin Islands. The men resented the assignment. Flying at 50 feet over enemy-held water felt like begging for a gunner's bullet, but the objective was clear: choke the supply line to Iwo Jima. On November 6th, Technical Sergeant Herman Scearce climbed aboard a B-24 loaded with 2,000-pound mines, each packed with over 1,200 pounds of TNT. The 7-plane flight staged through Saipan, where crewmen removed the belly turrets to save weight and installed special bomb bay racks. The attack on Iwo Jima caught the Japanese by surprise. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire too late, and the liberators were already past the release point, speeding away. Scearce sat at his radio operator's table, feeling the plane shudder as the mines fell. The mission was uneventful by combat standards, but it marked a turning point. Scearce was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his role in the raid. In a separate letter, Captain Charlie Bunn wrote that Scearce's work had materially increased the efficiency of this squadron. He logged mission number 8, and the count began to climb. 3 weeks later, on November 29th, a 4-plane Mike formation approached Chichijima through a narrow canyon between mountain peaks. The lead pilot, Lieutenant Phil Crow, threaded his aircraft through the pass so tightly that his wingtips overlapped those of his wingmen. Lieutenant Bob Strong, flying left of the formation, banked hard and felt a bump. His right wingtip had slapped the nose of Lieutenant Herb Robinson's plane, and a 1,000-pound mine from Robinson's ship crashed through the side of Strong's fuselage. The mine lodged just behind the right waist gun, pinching the control cables and dragging the plane down with its parachute trailing behind. Waist gunners Vince Sutter and Al Newell grabbed an axe and chopped the parachute shroud lines, then pried the mine free with their machine gun barrels. The plane lost altitude rapidly but held together for the 800-mile flight to Saipan. Strong landed smoothly, and the crew climbed out, exhausted and alive. The aircraft was written off, but it became a spare parts depot for the squadron, a missed tech supply. Scearce heard the story in the briefing room and shook his head. Every mission carried a chance to end like that, or worse. January 1945 brought a bitter loss. Lieutenant Charlie Pratt and his crew, old-timers who had survived the desperate parachute landing on Tarawa more than a year before, took a B-24 to lay mines at Iwo Jima on the 22nd. Joe Hyson was a gunner on Pratt's crew, a regular companion of Scearce's on Oahu who had helped him trade liquor for plywood on Guam and shared the simple joy of ice on a hot afternoon. He was aboard. The plane never returned. Two B-24s searched and spotted smoke on a raft, but no rescue came. Japanese documents later revealed that the bomber crashed into the cliffs above Maru and Wan. There were no survivors. Scearce learned the news after returning from another mission to Iwo Jima. The loss of Hyson, a man he had shared laughs and poker games with, cut deep. Days passed, and the squadron flew on. Scearce's mission count reached 20, then 25, climbing toward the halfway mark of 40. The tempo was relentless, 9-hour flights, often 2 or 3 a week. Each sortie over Iwo Jima or Chichijima carried the same risk. Men died, and the squadron filled the gaps with replacements. Scearce stayed on Captain Stay's crew, flying with men he trusted, but the faces around him changed too often. He began to carry a quiet weight, the understanding that luck could run out at any moment. On January 26th, he watched Stay complete his 40th mission and felt a pang of envy mixed with dread. On a sunny January afternoon, Scearce and Joe Hyson, before Hyson's final flight, had discovered that the Navy Seabees on Guam had an ice machine. Ice was a luxury beyond measure on a tropical island where everything was warm and damp. They acquired a chunk and rushed back to the squadron day room, where a crowd of men gathered around the phonograph. Scearce and Hyson held up the ice, letting the others take turns sucking on it, laughing at the sheer novelty of cold. The moment was simple, but for Scearce it became one of the most vivid memories of the war. A brief, shared pleasure that cut through the gray routine of combat. By the end of January, Scearce had flown 36 missions. The squadron's losses weighed on him, Pratt, Hyson, and so many others. But there was no time to grieve. The war pressed on, and the bombers kept rolling down Guam's runways toward Iwo Jima and beyond. Scearce sat in his tent on a plywood floor, staring at the mission board that tracked his count, halfway to 40. He had come close to death more times than he could count, and he knew the hardest miles still lay ahead. On February 8, 1945, 10 B-24s of the 42nd Bomb Squadron crossed the coast of Iwo Jima. Lieutenant Herman Beerworth, leading the third flight, had just released his bombs when a Japanese Zero rolled belly up and smashed into his fuselage at the top turret. The impact broke the Liberator's back. The right wing tore off, engine still turning, and the plane exploded. No one had time to bail out. 11 airmen died, all on their 39th mission, one shy of finishing their combat tour. Men in the other plane saw the fireball and the tumbling tail section. Inside that wreckage, Sergeant Richard Carton, a gunner who had survived a near miss from a 0 weeks earlier, now had no escape. 2 parachutes appeared for a moment, then burst into flames. None of the crew made it out alive. The remaining 9 liberators closed formation and turned back for Guam. When the news reached the squadron, the grief was raw. These were veteran crews, weeks away from home, and the war had taken them without warning. For men like Technical Sergeant Herman Scearce, counting down his own missions, the loss was a cold reminder that no lead pilot or old crew was ever safe. 2 days later, on February 10th, 10 more B-24s departed for Hahajima. The lead aircraft, Royal Flush, carried Lieutenant Edwin Brashear and Major Robert Holland, who was flying his 41st mission. At 16,000 feet, as the bombardier toggled the release, a phosphorus anti-aircraft shell exploded inside the bomb bay. The auxiliary fuel tanks ignited instantly. Flames poured into the fuselage, and dense black smoke rolled through the plane. The 2 waist gunners slumped over their guns without moving. 50 seconds later, the Liberator crumpled, nose high, and broke apart. Tail gunner Sergeant Richard Chandler managed to bail out with severe burns. He was the only survivor. Scearce flew his own 39th mission that same day, bombing Iwo Jima. When he returned to Guam, he learned of the Royal Flush crash and remembered that Brashear's crew had needed just one more mission. The lesson was plain. Even at the finish line, the war demanded its price. On February 12th, 4 B-24s lifted off at intervals for a night strike on Iwo Jima. Scearce flew as radio operator on Captain Churchill's crew, his 40th combat mission. The bombs fell across Airfield No. 2. Searchlights groped for the bombers, but Churchill banked hard and slipped away in the darkness. It was an unremarkable night, routine even. On the 4-hour return flight, Scearce stood at the waist window, watching the black Pacific slide by beneath the wing. He counted to himself 36, 37, 38, 39, and now 40. When the Liberator rolled to a stop on Guam, he pulled off his boots in his tent, lay back on his cot, and whispered softly, 40. His combat tour was over. Within weeks, Scearce returned to the United States. He turned down a field commission, choosing to go home instead of serving as a radar officer. Later that year, he wrote to the mother of Bob Leip, the crewman lost with Deschert back in December 43. Mrs. Leah Hitchcock replied, thanking him and still hoping for word of her son. Scearce carried the war with him for the rest of his life. He married, raised 3 children, and worked as a magistrate in North Carolina. But Scearce never forgot the men who did not come home: Leip, Hyson, Pradett, and all the others who vanished into the Pacific. Their faces, like the whispered 40 on a February night, stayed with him as long as he lived. If you have family stories from the Pacific War or a memory of a veteran in your own life, we invite you to share them in the comments. We read every one. Please subscribe and give this video a like to support our work. Thank you for listening.